Thank you, Avila, and reminding us of the challenge that even though there's been an awful lot of progress that we need to mark in relation to conflict resolution in the North and from the Good Friday Agreement, there are areas that have yet not been implemented and touched, and so much further to go. Issues about violence and security, and we know there in other countries, when you talk about decommissioning and demobilisation, we have to remember in Northern Ireland we had a decommissioning process, but we didn't have a demobilisation process, and some of these issues are arising in very marginalised communities in terms of control in those communities and with women, but also that increased marginalisation and silencing and loss of voice, and that interfacing of that in a respectful way with those who are in positions of power in terms of listening, taking account and making changes and opening areas in terms of participation. And even if moving towards dealing with an issue of the legacy of the past, some critiques about how much that has been seen through a gendered lens or not. There are specific things around, as we all know, around women. And very clearly, I think, tying back to what Ambassador Anderson said, is that what we do at home in this island is important to the reputation abroad in Ireland's leadership role abroad, in which it's exercising extremely good leadership at present internationally within the UN. I'm delighted at this point to introduce Hanny Cueva Beteta, who is Policy Advisor of the Peace and Security Section Policy Division in UN Women. We are indeed so lucky to have such a range of local and international speakers with us today, with very practical application and linking it to both the international framework and the local framework. Hanny has supported the development of national action plans to implement 1325 and has been one of the main technical leading experts on the interagency work for the development of indicators on women, peace and security for use at the global level, as requested by the Security Council Resolution 1889. She is the practice manager of the Women, Peace and Security section in UN Women, and she oversees various global programmes on mediation and conflict resolution, peace building and post-conflict planning, rule of law and transitional justice, post-conflict governance and elections, among others. I'm wondering what the among others are after that list. She is also one of the main authors of UNIFEM's flagship report, Progress of the World's Women 2008-2009, named Who Answers to Women, Gender and Accountability. She is originally from Peru, where she had a previous academic career, but we're very pleased that she's working with that background in UN Women. Hanny.
Thank you so much. And I would like to start also by thanking Melanie and Ronan for this kind invitation. It's really my pleasure to be here to discuss implementation of Resolution 1325, and especially of the whole Women, Peace and Security agenda, because sometimes we forget that the number 1325 doesn't necessarily communicate to people that do not know about it what is this about. It is about women, peace and security. And what I would like to do is share with you some lessons learned from a global perspective, and mostly, of course, from the UN, and to some extent purely sometimes normative advances. But I think that they are contributing to building a bit of a global accountability framework, and that has some potential to generate some impact, as years pass by. I will compare that a little bit with the experiences of developing national action plans, and we'll try to identify some elements by which member states can contribute to the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And I would like to start by recognizing that, unfortunately, still today, the typical experience of women leaders when conflict erupts is that their courage and actions are often followed, as the ambassador said, by marginalization from formal peace processes and any conflict resolution processes. And I would like to share the story of the former deputy mayor, Maiga Hassisa Mint Kadra, in Timbuktu. When the rebels stormed it in April, she was kicked out of office, and she fled to the south. In the south, she started organizing women and working towards peace and visibilizing especially women's contribution and experience of conflict. She even organized a fact-finding mission of mayors, of municipal leaders, actually, in June 2012 to review the situation of refugee camps in Burkina Faso and elsewhere. And she delivered alarming news about the destitution of women, girls refugees, turning to sex work for survival in the refugee camps. And she worked behind the scenes also in the north to encourage rebel leaders to join the negotiations in Ouagadougou. And she's a natural mediator. But was she, as a peace leader, invited to the talks in Ouagadougou or any other conflicts, any other attempts of conflict resolution by the international or national actors? No. Women around the world every day make significant contributions to conflict resolution and to community reconciliations. And they're usually not found at the peace table. They usually are in charge of family well-being. They are in charge of food production and water collection, among others. But they are rarely included in all peace building and recovery processes when they start post-conflict. And they are sometimes survivors of terrible crimes, including sexual violence. But the attempts to condemn these crimes and especially provide redress still requires very, very much strengthening. And I think this is why we're here today, partially, because more than 12 years after the resolution has passed, women are still routinely facing exactly the same challenges for which the resolution was written. Implementation has and continues to be, unfortunately, very, very slow. And the extent of the impact, especially on the lives of women, the real impact in the lives of women in conflict and post-conflict situations, has been very limited and is yet to be proven. But let me start with a bit of a positive note. Let me start a little bit with the normative advances. And the reason I want to go there is because then I want to tell you the story of how the indicators to track implementation of 1325 were developed and passed, and how they have the potential, hopefully, to help support and advance implementation. So there have been five resolutions on women, peace, and security. The first one was in 2000. That was, the most landmark resolution, 1325, because it was the first to recognize not only the fact that women experience conflict in a different way, but they were agents of change. They were leaders that could and should be included in conflict resolution and peace-building processes. But in the last 5 years, 4 new resolutions were passed. And this is, if you count, it was 7 years after the passing of the first ever resolution. These were 4 resolutions, 3 of them linked to sexual violence. Resolutions 1820, 1888, and 1960 established, essentially, that conflict-related sexual violence can be a central military tact, can be organized to advance political goals and military objectives. This is the first time they define this as a security threat, specifically. And these 3 resolutions aim to prevent and address conflict-related sexual violence, to improve assistance to survivors, and support the establishment of field-driven systems for generating data on incidents and patterns on sexual violence to be reported to the Security Council, which you've heard about already. But I would like to talk a bit more about Resolution 1889, which was passed in 2009. It was, together with 1325, a resolution that recognized the role of women as leaders. And it did 2 very interesting things. Resolution 1889 called for a report on women's participation in peace building to be presented in 2010, not in the open debate of women, peace, and security, but in the discussions around peace building, which is the more mainstream body working on peace building in the UN. And this is important to not narrow the gender, the women, peace, and security agenda to the gender world only. But it also called for the development of a set of indicators to track implementation of 1325 to be presented in the anniversary, which was in 2010. So the report on women's participation in peace building that this resolution requested was really interesting. It presented a 7-point action plan to the Security Council that provides pragmatic and specific changes in approaches to mediation, to post-conflict elections, to post-conflict planning, financing for recovery, deployment of civilians, providing technical support, justice and security sector reform, including transitional justice, and economic recovery. And it presented targets, such as doubling the UN's peace-building spending on gender equality and women's empowerment to reach a minimum of 15% of post-conflict funds, and ensuring that women access at least, for example, 40% of jobs in temporary employment programs that are implemented post-conflict. It is a very robust policy framework, and it was a huge leap for the UN in terms of accountability. It was, if you wish, an equivalent of a first global action plan on women in peace building. And probably for this reason, the SG himself identified its implementation as one of its 5 top priorities for his second term. So that's one piece in 2010. The second piece was the indicators, the set of indicators to use at the global level to track implementation of the resolution. This is 10 years later, 10 years after the resolution has passed. Now, these set of indicators, I think, have contributed to building accountability. They provide a core set of data on the extent to which women, for example, participate in peace talks, the gender content of peace agreements, the extent to which post-conflict reparations, demobilization programs, and economic recovery efforts benefit women. They have already been partially populated, and they have been included in the 2 reports in 2011 and 2012 presented to the Council, which are publicly accessible. They have been adapted also and modified by member states, developing national action plans to implement Resolution 1325, and have even inspired the development of similar sets by regional organizations, including the European Union. So these 2 elements, I think, added an element of accountability 10 years later after the resolution was passed to start implementing or to start tracking the implementation, to be able to say what is slow and what is advancing to some extent. And many of the lessons learned to accelerate implementation have been, some of the presenters before me have already talked about them, and very many of them. Most notably, the call for increasing women's participation and representation in all aspects of peacekeeping, peace building, and peacemaking. But let me talk a little bit about how the indicators have helped us in developing this evidence base that the ambassador was talking about earlier. Now, for some, and it's important to say this, the development of these indicators was completely anticlimactic for a 10th anniversary of 1325. Some consider this a technical exercise that could never capture the richness and complexities of the phenomena I try to measure, and it's partially true. But for others, it was considered a breakthrough, a first step towards meaningful accountability that could turn these words in the resolution into a bit more action. And the impetus really behind them came from the realization that there were no baselines. When you started asking in 2009 how many women are in peace processes, nobody can give you an answer. And it was only 2 years ago when we were still counting women's participation in peace processes by searching through Google and looking at the pictures to see how many women were there. So, it is impressive. It was only 2 years ago that we were doing this. And now finally, we have a bit of a set of indicators. We were aware when we were building these of the challenges and risks on insisting on quantification. We were not blind to it. We were aware that a lot of data not only did not exist, but would not exist and could not exist in the short or medium term because of the ingrained challenges of measuring anything in conflict and post-conflict situations. We also were fully conscious of developing of the complexities in developing indicators that were meant to be consensual, because those indicators were built together with civil society organizations. It wasn't an exercise that was left to the UN alone. And we were very worried also about the overemphasis on benchmarks and indicators, but we still went through a way. We still went with it. And I would like to explain a little bit of why, because I think that tells us how it can help us on accountability. First, because despite their limitations, we did believe in the power of numbers to affect policy and normative development. A couple of examples here. I was telling you before about the goal that the UN agreed to dedicate 15% of peace-building funds to gender equality issues and women's special needs. And this was prompted by a study of multi-donor trust funds supported by the UN, as well as there were a couple of PRSPs, the Poverty Reduction Strategy papers, and post-conflict needs assessments that essentially found that less than 5% of the funding allocated in these post-conflict planning processes were dedicated to gender equality issues and women's issues. Similarly, it was case studies about the proportion of women heading households in post-conflict situations and their contribution, which was estimated to be higher than men's contribution to household and community recovery. Those were the data that allowed us to push for a minimum 40% quota on women's involvement in post-conflict temporary job creation when the UN is engaged, that is. So generating some of these numbers, even at a small scale, that did help us in at least affecting policy and normative development. The second reason why we went ahead with these indicators was because we believed that there was value in the systematic collection of this information, even on some indicators that were considered less meaningful. For example, it is true that the number of women at the peace table or in parliaments or as gender advisors in senior leadership positions in peacekeeping and special political missions, or in regional organizations working in conflict prevention, or even in security and justice institutions doesn't tell us whether they are being gender responsive or whether they're further in gender justice. But you see, women's participation in these forums is part of the central goal of 1325, regardless of the issues they further. And the inclusion of information on violation of women's rights, another example, in missions periodic reports to the Council, or whether the Council addresses women, peace, and security issues in their missions to countries, doesn't tell you, again, much about their commitment to it. It tells you more about compliance. But then again, these are accountability markers that did not exist before. So we believe that even in the less meaningful indicators of this set, there was a possibility of developing these minimal accountability markers. And the third reason, and probably the most important one, is because the very act of tracking systematically these indicators, imperfect as they are, can lead to more meaningful findings and lines of inquiry. Again, a couple of examples. Counting the number of women in peace negotiations does not tell you how women fared in the peace table, does not tell you whether their views were indeed represented, and it does not tell you whether the gender content of peace agreements was related or not to them. It doesn't tell you that. But the consistent finding that women's percentage as peace negotiators remains in the single digits does send a signal, a compelling message on where are we in involving women in conflict resolutions. Or it does point out to the surprising fact that women's participation has actually been higher in those peace processes where the UN has not supported, which is what prompted the Department of Political Affairs and UN Women to implement a joint strategy to promote women's participation in mediation and formal peace processes. The actual effect of these indicators in having an impact on the lives of women afterwards is still to be seen. And these are still very controversial indicators in the context of negotiations of member states, especially within the Council. But I think the most significant outcome of their development was that the UN imposed in itself an accountability framework to implement 1325, which it hasn't done for 10 years. After the passing of the resolution. And they are truly the only indicators that we know of that are presented routinely to the Security Council. So very briefly, how could we compare the experience of these global indicators to the development of national action plans? I think there are at least two similarities. Both aim to be inclusive processes of elaboration, and the process of elaboration is as important as the outcome document. Because if you don't include civil society organizations, if you don't create that ownership, you won't get a product that will be defended and that can generate that partnership between civil society organizations and the government, which is needed, especially post-conflict. Second, it is the implementation and the reporting back on both cases that has the most potential to have an impact. National action plans, the actual plan being developed, is not what makes a difference. It's when you start implementing and start reporting back that you can start seeing where are the gaps, where are we going, where can we make progress, and where we need to do more work to advance. And very few national action plans have actually produced public reports of their review. So we need to put the action, I guess, back in the national action plans. But unlike the set of indicators, national action plans have a very important added value, and that they have the potential to transform women's lives, because they are about national implementation of the resolution. And an example of which I'm sure you've heard about on this is some initiatives on the localization of NAPs that is being undertaken by civil society organizations in various countries. In Nepal, for example, these localization efforts have created national peace committees that are comprised by a combination of civil society leaders and government officials, addressing what are the specific needs of the local district, I think it's at the district level, and establishing an action plan. And it's also an initiative that has started in Colombia, for example, where there is no action plan. So it tells us too that there is ways of starting implementation of the resolution without having to have a formal action plan. I want to just finish very briefly, probably echoing what has already been said in terms of what can member states do to support implementation of Resolution 1325, and what can Ireland itself can do in doing that. And first one is the potential to normative contributions, and I think the ambassador covered that beautifully. It's not only about the open debates, it is also about CSW, it is about the review of CEDAW reports, and now there is a general recommendation to report also on Resolution 1325 within the CEDAW reports. So ensuring that that is developed is important. And it's not only, of course, about the UN, it is also about other intergovernmental organizations, especially regional organizations that are increasingly playing a role in all kinds of peace and security matters. I mean, and I'm not talking about the EU only, it's also the OSCE. You've been covering that already. A second way in which member states are very important in implementing this resolution is, as Ireland has been doing actually, partnering and twinning efforts. Not only on the national action plans, and that is important too, it's also on the general implementation of the resolution. So it is about twinning national action plans, but sometimes it is also about, for example, generating local committees of civil society organizations, member states that are friendly to the promotion of the resolution, of Resolution 1325, and UN entities to strategize around what can be done at country level to support the implementation of the resolution. And this is particularly important probably in post-conflict countries. And thirdly, and probably most important than all, is leveraging their political capacity. It is different member states that organize donor conference or international engagement conferences to discuss the future of countries coming out of conflict. And women are routinely not invited to these international engagement conferences. We have been working with many member states trying to promote their inclusion, but sometimes it is the very member states that promote the implementation of the resolution that do not invite women, and that is critical. A second way is being custodians to ensure that gender is included in other intergovernmental processes, such as the New Deal or the post-2015 framework, which are having discussions around gender. And in this respect, I am sure the appointment of your very own Mary Robinson as the special envoy to the Great Lakes is a great opportunity. We are very proud of her appointment. She has been one of the most important activists also in furthering implementation of 1325. And she was not only your first woman president and the first women UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, but she has now become the first woman to be appointed as a special envoy by the UN, which is something that the United Nations committed in 2010, and only 3 years later, they managed to implement. And I'm sure she will make sure that people like Maiga from Timbuktu will not be excluded from peace processes. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.